Coming up, watch the hypercritical news coverage, read the over-the-top commentary on Twitter, watch and read the hyperbolic, obnoxious commentary from celebrities, and think back to the concept of playing for the reaction, and consider each one of those instances of overreaction as producing a potential set of new votes for President Trump. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Before we launch into the first subject, I have to apologize because this is going to be a short, much shorter than usual, episode. The reason why is I'm suffering from a severe toothache and I have to wait 2 more days for my root canal. I promised to give you guys an episode every week, and they're scheduled on Sunday, so I'm going to keep that schedule. But because I'm sure you don't want to hear me start screaming, and if I try to dull the pain with alcohol, it'll sound like a bad Joe Biden interview, that's not an option. So a really short episode is the only way to go. The first subject to cover is, if you listened to last week's episode, you know that I said that Judge Barbara Lagoa of Florida had to be considered the leading contender for President Trump's nomination of a replacement for the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I didn't technically predict that he would choose her. I only said that she should be considered the leading contender. But regardless, President Trump did not pick Judge Barbara Lagoa. Instead, he chose the judge who was more widely considered in advance to be the leading contender, Judge Amy Coney Barrett. So why did he choose Judge Barrett rather than Judge Lagoa? Well, interestingly, there are reports that there was a battle within the White House over which of those 2 judges to choose. There was a Barrett camp and a Lagoa camp, and interestingly, those in the Lagoa camp were making some of the arguments I was making from a political perspective, including helping win Florida in the election and emphasizing President Trump's gains in the Hispanic community and emphasizing his tremendous strength in the Cuban community. As I pointed out, those topics, as well as Joe Biden's weakness among Hispanics, would become part of the news cycle in the event of a Lagoa nomination. But the president went a different direction. He went with a judge that is probably more widely recognized as in the mold of the late Justice Antonin Scalia. In that respect, it was more of a clear signal to the most conservative members of his base, including religious conservatives, that he was fulfilling a campaign promise. Judge Lagoa's decisions at the federal level are quite limited, whereas Judge Barrett has an extensive history of writing and commentary as a law professor to help guide those evaluating her judicial philosophy. There's another angle to his decision. It's vintage Trump. I pointed this out way back in episode 43 entitled Playing for the Reaction. President Trump plays for the reaction. It would probably be more precise to describe it as playing for the overreaction. He does things and says things which spur the other side to overreact and undermine their position. And by the other side, I don't just mean Democrat candidates, including Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and Democrat Party spokespersons. I also mean the media, academia, and celebrities. Political commentator Ben Shapiro, as a guest on CNN, once tried to educate host Don Lemon about that very issue, telling him basically, you guys just need to take it to level 8 instead of cranking it up to 11. Ironically making reference to This Is Spinal Tap, a movie directed by perhaps the most diehard anti-Trumper of all, Rob Reiner. Don Lemon rejected the advice, as have basically all of the Democrat candidates and the rest of the media. So by choosing the more clearly demonstrably conservative candidate, by choosing the more religious candidate, by not choosing the Hispanic candidate, the candidate who might have blunted criticism of her by media figures anxious about aggressively criticizing a Hispanic judge, President Trump maximized the likelihood that the Biden campaign, Democrat leadership, opponents of Republican Senate candidates, the news media, and a multitude of public figures on the left would overreact, thus angering voters on the right, Catholics, and devout Christians in general, and driving them to the polls. If you're not a Trump fan, you might say, well, he's just a troll. That's what he does. But trolling involves saying or doing something outrageous or inflammatory. There's nothing outrageous or inflammatory about nominating Judge Amy Coney Barrett. She's just conservative. And I suppose the fact that many people on the left may find her nomination inflammatory says much about the extent to which acceptance of contrary opinions in our society has deteriorated, especially on the left. Watch what happens over the next few weeks. Watch the guests and commentators on CNN and MSNBC attack Judge Barrett's faith. And watch how misplaced and mean-spirited that seems every time you see a photo of Ms. Barrett, her husband, and their 7 wonderful kids, including 2 adopted from Haiti and a special needs child with Down syndrome. And I'm not alone in this view. Former Democrat Senator Joe Lieberman, a man who I've labeled on this podcast as the most likable, genuine politician I ever met, the kind you'd want as a next-door neighbor, said when you start to say that you're against a nominee because of their religion, in this case their Roman Catholicism determines their point of view, quote, you're doing something really abhorrent that I think is bigoted, is un-American, close quote. Trust me, it isn't only Joe Lieberman who feels that way. Judge Barrett, if approved by the Senate, will also be the first mother of school-age children to serve on the Supreme Court. Watch the hypercritical news coverage. Read the over-the-top commentary on Twitter. Watch and read the hyperbolic, obnoxious commentary from celebrities. And think back to the concept of playing for the reaction. And consider each one of those instances of overreaction as producing a potential set of new votes for President Trump. Next topic. Florida Governor DeSantis is the man. I said long ago that I considered Florida Governor Ron DeSantis a leading candidate to be on the Republican presidential ticket in 2024. Well, the actions he took in the last week reaffirm my prior conclusion. Governor DeSantis introduced a bill that increases penalties for disorderly assemblies, blocking roads, and damaging monuments, making those crimes third-degree felonies. In DeSantis' words, quote, we have zero tolerance for violence, zero tolerance for disorder, and zero tolerance for looting. A couple more points about the bill. It also makes a third-degree felony obstructing traffic during an unpermitted protest. And in a move that will surely shock those on the left prone to sympathize with protesters that obstruct highways, if a disorderly assembly is occurring, if the driver hits a person who's obstructing traffic, the driver can avoid any liability for injury or death if fleeing for safety from the mob. DeSantis also proposed enhanced penalties for throwing objects at or otherwise assaulting law enforcement during assemblies, including minimum jail sentences of 6 months for assaulting a law enforcement officer. And there's more. It makes it a first-degree misdemeanor for participants in a violent or disorderly assembly to harass or intimidate a person at a public accommodation like a restaurant. Think of all those instances you've seen on video of diners being harassed and even assaulted at restaurants. And now think about this proposed new law. And it attaches RICO liability, that's racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organizations liability, and that includes triple damages for anybody who organizes or funds a violent or disorderly assembly. There's also a penalty enhancement for participation in a violent or disorderly assembly by a person from another state. The message is clear. Don't come to Florida to engage in violence. And he went even further. There will be no state grants for aid to any local government that slashes the budget for law enforcement. It also waives sovereign immunity so that a victim of criminal activity in a violent or disorderly assembly can sue local government for damages where the local government is grossly negligent in protecting, or rather failing to protect, them. Governor DeSantis is making it crystal clear there will be no Portland, Oregon riot insanity in Florida. Thank God. And there's even more. If you're convicted of participating in a violent or disorderly assembly, you're ineligible for state benefits, and any you're already receiving will be terminated, and you'll be prohibited from getting a job with state or local government in Florida. And he's not finished. You can't get bail for these violations until your first court appearance. And then, even at your first court appearance, there will be a rebuttable presumption that you're not entitled to any bail. Just as Tennessee ramped up their penalties for rioting and obstructing highways, essentially issuing an open invitation to companies and citizens of out-of-control blue states, Florida, at the hand of Governor DeSantis, is taking the same steps, only more so. Florida has been on the list for a seeming eternity for anybody looking to relocate from the Northeast. And if I look out my window at a swaying palm tree, I can certainly see why, provided I ignore the 2 to 3 foot iguana walking across the yard. But now there's going to be even more to entice those relocations. The governor is showing that Florida represents safety. It represents relief from the mayhem. It represents sanity. It represents order. And with these steps, Governor DeSantis will help to ensure that it will transition from a purple state to a red state. And that would help guarantee the safety that everybody is seeking. So that's a big proposal from Governor DeSantis in the last week, but that's not all he did. He also moved bars and restaurants statewide into coronavirus stage 3 of reopening. In other words, he lifted all state restrictions and prohibited local restrictions unless the locality can demonstrate to the state a public health justification for those restrictions. The bottom line? Governor DeSantis is pitching to Florida citizens and those outside of the state who are thinking about becoming Florida citizens that Florida represents an island of sanity, supportive of business and providing the law and order that responsible citizens expect from their government. Will it work? Well, combine those components with warm winters, saltwater breezes, white sand beaches, fishing in the Gulf Stream, and a willingness to ignore giant iguanas, and I believe absolutely it will. And the other thing I believe absolutely is that I can't wait until 2 days from now when I get a root canal. And that tells you how much pain I'm in, which means I have to call this episode to a close. But I'll be back next week, hopefully with a repaired tooth and ready to present you with a full-length episode. Please join me and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.